designated as an area of natural and scientific interest in 1989 with Steve Varga doing that survey. In recognition of the rare tallgrass conditions and the decline of the quality of the park, the City of Toronto consulted with Steve Apfelbaum, and by 1997, the current burn program was initiated along with other forms of vegetation management and ecological restoration. A second round of inventories of the park occurred mostly around 2008, but roughly between 2005 and 2010. TRC did some in 2005 and 2008. James Kempster surveyed rare plants around then. There was also an ESA update by North-South Environmental that also collected some data in the park. A full inventory of the park was undertaken in 2018 by TRCA, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, which is the main topic of our conversation today. And following that, just last year, we did additional surveys on the west side of the park and into Rennie Park for a wetland evaluation, which we'll be discussing very briefly at the end of this talk, but it is still under review. So most of our material is about 2018. So we'll hand it over to Sue now.
So I'm just going to start by describing the methods that we use to collect the data in the park. Next. There are four components to our inventory work, and I'm just going to introduce all four here and then go into a bit more detail in the coming slides. So we scored and ranked all of the native herbaceous flora, vertebrate fauna, and all the vegetation communities that are found throughout the TRCA region. And the main point of the system is that it's proactive rather than reactive to species conservation. Next. We use standardized protocols. The ecological land classification for Southern Ontario is used in order to describe the vegetation communities. We inventory the vascular plants. And lastly, the inventory includes the breeding bird surveys and breeding frogs. One main point about this methodology to keep in mind is that although it's quite detailed in terms of the level of information that is gathered, it is still rather a quick assessment of the area, and it provides a snapshot in time, if you will, of the current conditions. It obviously would be quite expensive to accurately detail all of the species that are present, so we really have to strike a balance of collecting enough information that we feel comfortable and being able to comment on the biodiversity and how the natural area is functioning while not spending the full summer trying to collect it. Next. This map represents what biologists were observing in the late 80s and early 90s in our jurisdiction. There was a clear distinction between the types of species and vegetation communities found in the urban core versus the more rural areas of our jurisdiction. There are a total of 1,111 native flora and fauna species that can be found throughout our watersheds, but only 418 of these are found in the urban land use zone. So on this map, the urban is the peachy color, if you will, down in the southern portion of the map, and the green and yellow to the north are the rural portions of our jurisdiction. And the brown dots represent the other 693 species. So when we do the math of 1,111 minus 418, we end up with 693 species that are no longer found in the urban land use zone. And these are what we refer to as the species of regional conservation concern. So of those 693 species, approximately only 3% are listed as species at risk. So based on the current species at risk legislation, only 3% would trigger some kind of action or protection. So we need a system that kicks in earlier in order to prompt biodiversity protection. Next. So our local ranking system is based on the North America-wide NatureServe ranking that's applied to a local level. And I'm not going to go into all the details around the scoring criteria, as that would be a whole other presentation, but we did go through a lengthy peer review process to develop the criteria. What is important to note is that the criteria capture ecological sensitivity of species, so things like habitat requirements, so whether a species is a habitat generalist or a specialist, or if a species has area requirements. Some species, like a red-shouldered hawk, for example, would need larger tracts of forest to breed versus a species like a red-tailed hawk that's more of a generalist and found in smaller natural areas. So our local ranks are based on L1 to L5. L1 to L3 are regional species of conservation concern. L4 are urban species of conservation concern. So the L1 to L4 are species that we point mapped throughout the park when we were doing the inventory, and I'll come back to this in the coming slides. And then L5 are species that are considered not of concern at this time. Next. As I indicated for the vegetation communities, we're following the ecological land classification for Southern Ontario. The botanists cover the entire site, delineating polygons of similar assemblages of vascular plant species that are present. They describe up to 4 structural layers in the community and documenting the dominant species and also giving a % cover of each of the vegetation layers, and then applying an ELC code to that particular community. So the map that you can see here on the right, the polygons of the vegetation communities have been delineated, are outlined in red, and it has an ELC code attached. So in the center of the screen, the larger polygon there, FOD14, is the ELC code that applies to a community type of dry, fresh, mixed oak deciduous forest. Within each of these polygons, we're also indicating levels of disturbances, such as invasive species or trampling or trails. Next. Flora surveys are done in conjunction with the ELC mapping. They start in May and go through till September. And the botanists target deciduous and mixed forest in early May in order to capture the spring ephemerals, so species like bloodroot or trout lily, and then other community types as the various species are flowering. At Hyde Park, we map, so giving GPS coordinates for locations of all species that are ranked L1 to L4. The map on your right, again, showing an area where the species locations were mapped. The botanist dropping a point on a GPS unit indicating what the species was and giving an approximate size of the population at that particular location. So all species, regardless of their rank, they end up on an overall site list for the site. And we set a 15-year threshold date in terms of whether or not we consider the species present or more of a historical record. Next. For the fauna inventory, we target breeding birds. These surveys are conducted throughout the last week of May to the first week of July when birds are on breeding territory. A minimum of 2 visits are made in order to document the highest level of breeding activity and also to try and ensure that the birds are actually using the site for breeding and are not just migrating through. So similar to the botanical surveys, the biologist visits all of the natural habitat present on site and is mapping the species ranked L1 to L4. The map on your right demonstrates this method. One thing to note is that each point represents a possible breeding territory. It's where the biologist will hear or see the bird, but not necessarily where there's a nest. The second component to these surveys are the breeding toad and frog surveys, and they're conducted in the spring during the evening hours when the temperatures and precipitation are within the range of conditions for the various species to be in the wetlands. Lastly are the incidental observations. Since we cannot properly inventory all fauna species on a site, we will document the other species from different taxonomic groups, such as mammals, for instance. Would put like coyotes, foxes, skunks, raccoons. They would go on to an overall site list, but not targeting those in our surveys. Next.
So after all that methodology, after applying it to Hyde Park, what do we find on the site? Well, I'm going to go over the vegetation and flora at this point. Our results. Next. And in terms of the vegetation communities, well, we found quite a lot, actually, as you might expect. This table shows there was a total of about 97 hectares of natural areas surveyed, and an additional 50 hectares we didn't survey because it was developed or manicured: Hillside Park, High Park, Grenadier Restaurant, etc. So of that 97 hectares of natural cover, there was about 50 hectares of forest characterized by tree cover over 60% roughly, and 30 hectares of dynamic. Now, dynamic is a term we use to capture vegetation communities that are maintained in semi-open or open condition by natural or pre-settlement processes. So that, in the case of High Park, that dynamic would mostly refer to the oak woodland and savanna, which is not quite forest because it's quite open, but it's also treed because it has open grown oaks in it. So about 30 hectares, most of which is that. So that's actually about a third of the natural cover. Smaller areas of successional, which are old gardens, edge habitats, abandoned, human use lands, and almost no meadow. Meadow is very characteristic of all the agricultural fields, and High Park was barely ever used for agriculture, except for a very small area of sheep farm around the Colburn Lodge, which became the Hillside Garden. So it basically went straight from original oak woodland to city park without going through the agricultural phase. Wetlands and aquatic together about 10 or 11 hectares, but we added more in our later survey as we expanded the area for the wetland evaluation. Mostly sources Grenadier Pond and seepage areas along the ravines. So the L ranks of the communities are quite high on the right for the particularly for the dynamic, and even most of the forest, wetland, and aquatic. The preponderance of the area is actually at least of urban conservation concern. Next. And when you actually divide the area by amount of land covered by different communities, what these pie charts compare two areas that have roughly the same number of total plant species in them. High Park and Albion Hills, which is a very large conservation area with a lot of high quality vegetation in the north end of the jurisdiction, where Sue was talking about, where things are more intact and have less urban pressures. However, High Park is quite exceptional because of all the oak woodland. You can see the dark green slice of pie is much larger in High Park. That's the communities of regional conservation concern share of the High Park than at Albion Hills, which is the opposite of what you'd expect. High Park does have more of that pink developed manicured area and yellow weedy exotic. Albion Hills has, a small slice of L1 to L3 communities, but has a lot of pine plantation on old agricultural fields. And pine plantation is natural cover, but it's ranked L5. Next. So where are all these high quality vegetation communities shown in High Park? The green tones on here are L1 and L2 communities, the tall grass ones. L3 are the orange, various types of other types of fairly sensitive communities. And you can see they're mostly on the tablelands adjacent to the valleys of Wendigo Creek on the west and Spring Creek on the right. And you can even see forming a bridge north of the restaurant, areas that were restored, I think beginning in the 90s, Hawk Hill and so forth. So there's actually a lot of tall grass woodland here that forms quite a connected system, and smaller areas of wetland along the valleys and immediately adjacent to Grenadier Pond. Next. So of course, the most significant communities fall into the two general categories, oak woodland and savanna. grading into forest. But you can sort of see this is the nicest, one of the nicest areas in High Park, where you can see the open grown black oak and a few white oak in the background with wide gaps between, allowing a lot of sunlight in, and the open tall grass ground layer maintained by prescribed burns. And the grasses in there are mostly big bluestem, which is one of the prairie grasses. And there's also a lot of wildflowers in there at various times of the year. And then the other category, next, wetlands, as I mentioned, most along Grenadier Pond and evaluated more recently. They form a sort of a secondary area of high quality communities. And then, of course, there's deciduous and mixed forests along the ravine slopes, which include some more northern species in them as well. Next. So in terms of flora species, according to our 2018 protocol, so that from about 2003 to 2018, 620 vascular plants found. When we did our wetland evaluation, we got a bit more data, expanded our area and expanded our year count to 20 years for that protocol, and the count was up to about 730 species of plants in total. But in 2018, current plants within High Park, 620 species, which is quite high, of course. 71 of those are planted because there's a lot of plantings in an urban area. And you'll notice that there's 75 L1 to L3 species that are of regional conservation concern, and an additional 77 L4 species of urban conservation concern. So that's a very, it's a biodiversity hotspot, no doubt about that, even though it's in an urban area. Let's have a next. We will look at where comparing them with a couple of other areas here. These pie charts show the distribution of flora conservation ranks in comparing three sites, High Park and Albion Hills, which I mentioned earlier with the vegetation. And we also included a more typical disturbed area in some ways, the Meadowway, which is the Hydro Corridor in Scarborough that is undergoing restoration currently. All of these have roughly the same number of plant species. They may not be the same area and size, but you can see with the flora, Albion Hills does have the most flora of conservation concern, echoing Sue's comments about the rural areas having more. But High Park has quite a large dark green pie slice there for the 75, and then 77 the middle green pie slice. Meadowway, of course, is more representative urban area, and you can see the yellow non-native species and the blue planted species are a very high share there. So High Park is roughly intermediate between an urban site and a rural site in terms of overall biodiversity as a raw figure for flora, which is quite remarkable given that it is an intensely urban site. So a lot has been preserved. Next. So these flora of conservation concern, again, you can see that they're concentrated in those high quality vegetation communities, the areas above the ravines in the tallgrass, oak savanna, and woodland, and then a smattering along the lower slopes in the forests and in the wetlands along the shores of Grenadier Pond and the valley bottoms. Next. And the habitats in which they are found, of course, habitat dependence is one of the criteria used to assess conservation concern. Habitat specialists are more sensitive. And we have 52 L1 to L4 species. As you can see, these numbers add up to more than 75. So we're including the L4s in here as well because they're of urban concern. 52 species are characteristic of the tall grass habitats, oak, woodland, savanna, and prairie. There's actually a lot of forest plants in Hyde Park as well. The trilliums and hepatica come to mind in the deciduous forests. And the mixed forest with the hemlock and pine have 16 species of conservation concern. These are actually often more northern species that even though Hyde Park is quite Carolinian, there's a cool shaded areas with groundwater and conifers that have more northern species in than the mixed forests. A few species in the successional meadow areas, and 23, actually 30 if you include aquatic species, a wetland and aquatic species as well. And then a few generalist species that are of conservation concern because of other criteria than habitat specialization. So you can see there's a lot of species of conservation concern in quite a wide array of habitats here. So we'll have a look at some of those, just a sec. Next. This is a representative wildflower of the tallgrass savannas. It's a frostweed, crocanthemum. I believe it's Canadense, but anyway, this is only found in Hyde Park and Lambton Park in the whole TRCA jurisdiction. It's a stringent specialist of tallgrass woodlands and savannas. Flowers in early summer. It's quite spectacular. And it's good to see that it's still hanging on there. Next. Okay, one thing about the tallgrass savannas and woodlands in Hyde Park is they're not the same as the ones in southwestern Ontario, like at Walpole Island. Everyone has its own unique flavor, and Hyde Park is quite distinctive for these low shrubs, particularly ericaceous or heath family shrubs like blueberries and huckleberries, which you often get on the Canadian Shield. This huckleberry is one of the rare plants found in the tallgrass savannas that also responds to fire. Next. So let's have a look at how things are going in the ecosystems in Hyde Park. And the picture goes back to the 1880s because it's been botanized for a very long time, so we really have an opportunity to investigate what's been going on in the park. Next. And I'm afraid at the outset there is bad news at the outset, although there's good news later on. But there are currently 75 L1 to L3 flora found in Hyde Park. 100 of those are no longer present, and this fits in with what Sue was saying about our conservation ranking system. Some of these are no longer found anywhere near Toronto even. Indian paintbrush was last seen in 1890, this spectacular red wildflower. You got to go up to Carden Plain on the northeast side of Lake Simcoe to find that now. Next. Some hung on until more recently. The trailing arbutus is a gorgeous plant that hung on in the cooler, more acidic mixed coniferous forest until about 2000. The population just gradually diminished and then it died out. It lasted right up until the time that the restoration was beginning. Next. Wetland and aquatic species were hit particularly hard and early. This is probably because the wetlands receive a lot of contaminated runoff and nutrients and stormwater that alter the habitat really quickly, whereas the uplands, being more concave and receiving less contaminants, persist a bit longer. This water sedge was last seen in around 1980. Next. A water arum likes high quality peatlands. It was last seen in 1953. Fortunately, that one's still to be found in Kettle wetlands on the Oak Ridges moraine, but it hasn't been seen in the Hyde Park for about 70 years. Next. Largely pondweed, last seen in Grenadier Pond in 1896. There are still aquatic macrophytes and they might even be increasing, but it is a low diversity now. A lot of the early stuff disappeared very quickly. Next. So this chart, or this graph, I mean, shows the when species were last observed in the park. So it's an indicator of when local extinctions occurred. So on the left, the 20-year period, 1881 to 1900, 25 species that had been found in the park were last seen in the late 19th century. 15 were last seen in the 1901 to 1920 and then not seen subsequently, and so on. And you can see the local extinctions are carrying on right up to the present. There does seem to be a somewhat of a trend of slowing of losses in recent decades, but we still lost about 11 or 12 plants in the last 20 years or so, which is, you know, still quite concerning. Next. So why are these things disappearing? We'll have a look at some of the this list of possible reasons here. So as Sue was saying, we need to take this proactive approach because by the time something is rare, it can be too late. And so if the population is already low, even if the area is protected, it can have a bad year and simply blink out or just disappear. For example, this wintergreen on the left was seen in 2018. That is likely the sum total of the total population left in High Park. If the dog steps on that, it's gone, or just some random accident. So that's sort of what's been going on with a lot of this stuff. It just gradually disappears and then the population is no longer sustainable. And so that's why we're trying to bring in this ranking system and base our planning on that instead of upon species at risk. So this can continue even after burns and restoration begin because a burn might eliminate that. You need to propagate it. So several species discovered in the 1990s and 2000s in tiny populations and then disappeared after the restoration began. So that explains those recent decades. Next. In terms of ecological factors that are leading to declines, we're going to go through some of them here. They do contribute to the sensitivity criteria for scoring and ranking. One of the big improvements is fire suppression. A lot of the species were lost because the conditions had been terrible for oak savannas for quite a few decades until the burn program began. A lot of them get shaded out by as the area grows in. So the fire is improving that. Trampling is a huge issue in High Park because the park is basically loved to death. It's a real favorite for Torontonians. And the pandemic has, if anything, brought even more people out into the parks, which is a good thing in its own way, but it is leading to greater impacts. And I already mentioned runoff and nutrient deposition, particularly in the wetlands, but atmospheric deposition can also affect uplands. And plants of poor soils that grow slowly can get outcompeted if there's a nitrate influx from the atmosphere and rain into the ground. A few species are quite charismatic. The flowers can get picked or dug up. There were records of wood lily no longer present in the park that were picked by the armload, according to an old record. And given the small population's isolation of the park, it's more sensitive to natural or semi-natural disturbances such as storm damage. In 2018, there were 3 windstorms in the spring, and I noticed a lot of fallen white pine, which are not regenerating, so that the pines are declining, and outbreaks of insects such as gypsy moth or even native insects like cankerworms can affect the oak if there's not enough oak recruitment. And of course, invasive plants. There are a lot of those in High Park. There's some headway being made on the plant management program, but invasive plants are a big one. I'll just go through a few of those quickly. Winged euonymus is a big problem in the tall grass savannas and forests. It grows taller than the low shrubs and wildflowers and shades them out. There's a lot of that in the park. Northern maple is well known in the ravines across the city, particularly in forest habitats. Hyde Park has the dubious honor of hosting two kinds of invasive buckthorn as well, glossy as well as the regular. And Asiatic bittersweet is a big problem in parts of the park, particularly the east side. And even native woody vines are responding to climate change and nutrient deposition, we think. Riverbank grape is a big issue, even though it's native. And the scientific literature does show an expansion of woody vines in both temperate and tropical forests worldwide. Common reed is a big issue around some of the wetlands, and to some extent, giant manna grass and reed canary grass in a few places have been recorded. In the moister forests and shaded swamps, Himalayan balsam, pretty pink flowers, very invasive. And Japanese hedge parsley is a big issue in some of these disturbed areas, along with garlic mustard. And let's not neglect garden ground covers. Lots of old gardens in the park and gardens around the park. So a lot of our favorites like periwinkle, lily of the valley, goutweed, winter creeper euonymus and English ivy get out and take over the forest and oak savanna forest floors. Next. So what does that come back? We do have some success stories to share that we have found in our surveys. Restoration has been going on in High Park since the late 90s, and you can see a recently burned area here in this background photo. So let's have a look at some of the turnaround that's going on. Wild lupine never disappeared from the park. It almost disappeared, and the populations have expanded greatly since the burns began. And this is one of the rarest plants that's found only in High Park and Lambton in the Humber Plains. Next. This is some of the tall grass savanna I showed you earlier, but what this version of the slide shows is that if you see those little red ovals that are not very bold there, but you can sort of see those little areas drawn around, each of those is a young black oak seedling. For about 80 years, there was no black oak regeneration, and now it is starting again, both through plantings and through natural regeneration. This has occurred since the vegetation management and prescribed burns have set in. So it's turning around in the savannas. Next. With our low shrubs, remember this is one of the unique features of this particular example of tall grass savanna and woodland in Ontario. It's a little ambiguous with these low shrubs that grow only about a foot or two tall. So the blueberries and huckleberries, the ericaceous shrubs, 2018 they really looked good. The ones we found looked really good, and they seem to vigorously respond to burns based on anecdotal observations. However, TRC seemed to map fewer records than James Camster did in 2008, and we're not sure if this is because of differences in mapping methodology or if there's an actual decline in the number of individuals. Well, the ones that are surviving are expanding. We don't know don't know enough. They're still there. They look okay, but we don't know what direction they're going. The sweet fern, this This long-leaved low shrub here does seem to be declining, at least in part. Some of the areas are growing in quite densely, even with native vegetation, and the sites may be too fertile, and it can easily get outcompeted. So we've got to keep an eye on that one and maybe do a bit more to bring it back. And so you see that even that thin-leaved sunflower is taller than it, and the poison ivy in the foreground. Next. So remember I was talking about 100 species that were extirpated. These include ones where the original populations died out, but 10 of those have actually been reintroduced and seem to be persisting or expanding since the 90s. From left to right, we've got the white-flowered goldenrod, the silver rod actually is what it's called. It was died out in the 50s, and Southern Ontario populations are propagated and replanted in the park and the burn areas. You can see that burnt log behind there. And we found some of them doing quite well in 2018. Similar situation obtains with the orange butterfly milkweed in the middle and the swamp smartweed on the right along the shores of Grenadier Pond. So we'll hand this over to Sue Hayes for the next section.
Okay, just a few more slides here. Just moving into the fauna surveys. The focus again of the fauna surveys were to document the breeding birds and the frogs. The other groups there on the table here, other herpetofauna, so that refers to taxonomic groups such as reptiles and snakes, and then mammals are also, as I noted earlier, only captured during incidental observations. We do not do detailed investigations looking for mammals. But overall, in terms of the total numbers of species that were documented over the past 10 years, 68 have been documented using the park as breeding habitat. Obviously, if we were to include migratory bird species, this number would, substantially increase in terms of overall numbers. But of those 68 species, 38 were species of concern with a rank of L1 to L4, the majority being bird species in particular. Next. This map, you're not going to be able to work out the details, and that's okay. It's mainly to just demonstrate where we map the species of concern in the park, and generally they weren't really concentrated. They were found throughout, slight concentrations in the forest along the west and along the east side following the creek. Next. I'm going to go through some of the species, just highlighting a few of them. In terms of regionally rare species, the Carolina wren was the only species detected in the past 10 years of the park that would be considered regionally rare. It is a species that's been popping up in our surveys on several sites across the waterfront, and it seems that they really like the steeper cut ravines with the forest understory that are dark with lots of tangle from the vines and the shrubs. Next. Some of the species at risk, fauna species at risk that documented in the park. On the left, snapping turtle listed as a provincial concern, present in Grenadier Pond. Although it's an aquatic species, it does place its nest in sandy soils outside of the water, so it is prone to predation by raccoons and skunks. And we don't really have an understanding of the total population size within the park for this particular species, but I suspect that it might be low given the elevated raccoon populations in the city. However, an area resident who might be on this call today actually sent in some photos of hatchlings from 2020, so that's always a good sign. The middle bird there, one of my favorites, the wood thrush, 2 breeding territories were identified in 2018. It is listed as threatened federally and special concern in the province. It breeds in deciduous and mixed forests. It usually places its nest 2 to 2.5 meters above the ground. It is a species that is susceptible to parasitism by brown-headed cowbirds, but it's not all that area sensitive, so it will attempt to breed in smaller forest fragments. It mainly forages on the ground for insects during the breeding season, so very susceptible to predation by free-roaming cats, house cats. Chipmunks, along with other small mammals, birds such as blue jays and grackles are really the main nest predators for the wood thrush. On the right is the eastern wood pewee. There were 6 territories identified. The pewee's listed as special concern in the province, and it's not totally understood why populations are declining, but it is an aerial insectivore. And as we're seeing with many aerial insectivores, such as chimney swift, that's also noted for the park, it's likely linked to a food availability issue. Next. Area sensitive species, so this is one of our scoring criteria. Blue-gray gnatcatcher, there were 18 territories noted during the 2018 season, and this is a species that was once considered more Carolinian, but their breeding ranges have been expanding northwards, and we've been documenting, again, the species across several sites across the waterfront. The Cooper's hawk on the right, 1 territory, generally require mature, fairly dense woodlots. Historically, they nested primarily in extensive mature rural forests, but increasingly seem to be adapting to breeding in urban areas and taking advantage of the increased abundance of prey. Next. Ground or low nesting species. As with most urban natural areas, there's really a lack of breeding species that nest low or on the ground just due to the high numbers of predators. And also just the repeated flushing from the nest that can happen just by the volume of people or the amount of canine traffic that's present. So this is certainly true for High Park. Only 2 species were identified during the breeding season that really fit this category, and each one only held 1 territory. The spotted salamander, the spotted sandpiper was observed in 2018, but the common yellowthroat was noted in 2012, but not recorded again when we did the survey in 2018. Next. Forest edge species, just a couple of examples here. Blackbuilt cuckoo is 1 territory. So often it's a fun bird, generally not so concerned with the forest structure as it is with food availability, often in areas with higher forest tent caterpillars or gypsy moth outbreaks. Indigo bunting, beautiful bright blue bird, 5 territories were identified, and this is a bird that's quite common throughout many natural areas throughout the city. Next. The honorable mentions, we can't speak about the breeding birds and not mention the great horned owls. They seem to draw crowds of people to go and see them, which are great. They're there again this year. On the right, the gray catbirds, 11 territories identified. They like the vegetation tangle for their nests and are doing quite well in the urban areas. And they don't nest near the ground or on the ground and don't feed on the ground, so they do not have the same pressures as some of the other species. So they're doing quite well. Next.
So to close, just very quickly go over the wetland evaluation. As I say, this presentation was mostly about the 2018 surveys, but we did note that even though the uplands have been designated as an area of scientific and natural interest and received a lot of attention going back into the 70s and 80s, the wetlands have never actually been provincially evaluated. So we used some of our 2018 data and then surveyed an additional area on the west side of Grenadier Pond and into Rennie Park and Catfish Pond to incorporate into a wetland evaluation and expand also our ELC surveys. Next. So what we came up with is a Grenadier Pond wetland complex. And you can see the turtle head there, which is a wetland plant found in one of the seepage areas in High Park. So we did the additional surveys in 2020, mostly on the west of the park, and expanded our area of survey generally. Next. This included obviously more wetlands, but there's also more oak woodland or oak forest or oak woodland remnants in Rennie Park. So it really needs to be considered as one larger system. Next. It currently is under review, so it's not, the work is not complete. But it is safe to say that I would say it's a candidate provincially significant wetland complex. And what characterizes it? Well, the way we describe wetland communities is somewhat different from how we do ELC, although the delineation of what is a wetland or not a wetland is almost exactly the same, the community boundaries, but we describe them somewhat differently so we can incorporate some of the ELC. But anyway, there were a wide range of aquatic and emergent and woody swamp types in this whole wetland complex, with a lot of aquatic and marsh, but also some swamps. So quite a range. It does include several provincially tracked flora and fauna. The wetland evaluation system does include some foraging and regular users that aren't breeding. So the criteria are a little different than what we did. But there are several provincially tracked in the park. Next. We do incorporate foraging, migratory, and winter cover habitat as part of the wetland evaluation as well. In addition, the evaluation takes into account the extremely high social value of Grenadier Pond. It's used for nature appreciation and education and some other human uses. But let me put it this way, it's right up there with, in terms of its educational use, it's right up there as one of the top in southern Ontario, along with places like Point Pelee. Hydrologically, it's really encased by it's caught between the city and right by Lake Ontario, so it doesn't have a whole lot of hydrological downstream value, but it is a significant groundwater discharge area with a major aquifer underlying it and some good seepage zones. Next. So that wraps up, and we move on to the discussion period. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Just a reminder, so I do see that there's a hand up. If you have a question, you can also put it in the chat, in the Q&A, and we'll answer it. We did get a few questions via email, and one in particular, a few in particular around dog off-leash areas. And I will note that dog off-leash areas are dogs. Dog off-leash areas are a hot topic across the city, and the dog off-leash areas have recently, our citywide policy on dog off-leash areas has recently undergone a review by the Park Standards and Innovation branch, which deals with them. As part of this review, they've incorporated feedback from the dog off-leash area community in High Park, and will be generating a variety of suggestions and next steps for better management of these off-leash areas. And we hope that this will help guide some of the improvements that we know are needed in the dogs off-leash area in High Park. Park staff also work with municipal licensing and standards by law enforcement officers to do blitzes to ensure people are following the rules. So Pablo, if you could unmute Jenny Davis, and she can have a moment to ask her question briefly.
Sure thing.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I actually, it was exactly what you just suggested. I was just wondering, I read the report, and I live and I work in the park, and just the degradation, particularly east of Spring Road from dogs off leash. It's actually sad, like it's actually like worthy of crying. And I'm just wondering, what is going to happen? Because I actually looked from articles back from like the 1990s, and there was a call for action then from scientists saying that if nothing is done, we're going to lose incredible species, and we are, because of many dog off leash and their owners.
Yeah, we know this. Like as I said, we know this is an issue. Our colleagues are on it. We do ask if you note dogs off leash that shouldn't be, you are also welcome to call 311 to report it, and a by law enforcement officer could be sent to address it. Okay, so I have a question about, there's lots of questions coming in now. Just a sec. So there's a question about the use of glyphosate in the park. Is it still being used in the pond, and have there been negative effects on other species? I think that might be for the TRCA.
Well, I can say that around the pond, what I found in 2020 in areas where there had been Phragmites, I did find there were some early mudflat species appearing, such as a couple of types of nutsedge or cyperus, some of which are species of concern, and the swamp smartweed that I showed in the slide earlier is also along the pond margin. So there are some signs of vegetation recovery there. Now the wetlands, obviously the whole kind of nutrient loading situation in the pond presents a particular challenge. We do think it's hard to tell because we didn't have measurements in the 80s, but the historical literature seemed to show a lower level of aquatic vegetation and of shoreline marsh in the 70s and 80s than there are now, since there were water quality improvement measures undertaken. So there's a hint that the aquatic community and wetland communities are actually expanding again, though not with the biodiversity that was there previously.
Thank you. We had another question about what is being done to increase fauna diversity in the park, and specifically I mentioned here about how there are no longer any groundhogs in the park and there are very few red squirrels. I can't recall if that was mentioned in the presentation. Can you speak to that as well?
I'll speak to it. As I noted, we do not survey for those species. It's incidental observations, and certainly as a regular park user, I can also say that I've never actually seen a groundhog in High Park, which is it is a bit surprising. Red squirrels are a funny one in urban areas. They seem to be associated with the pines, and certainly there are some in High Park. I don't know if anybody's ever looked at the abundance of them, but we have a lot of gray squirrels and as well. So they could be competing for food. I don't know the specific reasons, but we have lots of predators in the park for both of those species, and lots of people and lots of disturbance. So in terms of the groundhog, it might be an issue. I'm not really sure. I can't really speak to that.
Thanks, Sue. I have a follow-up question on reeds. Is there a plan to deal with the aquatic reed populations? Given the shallow nature of the issue, can you dewater small areas to permit treatment?
I'm not really clear on the question. Sorry?
So is there a plan to deal with the aquatic reed populations?
The Phragmites.
Reed? The Phragmites? That would come from a different department. My understanding is that there are some TRCA staff in our restoration services working with the park staff and trying to figure out a plan forward in regards to Phragmites in particular.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no other questions, unless anyone has any, we can move on to the parks presentation, the urban forestry presentation.
Sorry, Daniel, just very quickly, I noticed, and we weren't very clear, but there's some questions coming in the chat and some in the question and answer box. Perhaps let's ask everybody to focus the questions in the Q&A so that we can make sure to get to the questions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Not all displaying for me.
Jennifer and Jacqueline, over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Hello, and thank you for being with us today. My name is Jacqueline Scobie. I'm a Parks Program Officer, And here with me is Natural Resource Specialist Jennifer Gibb. High Park is a special place with many different attributes, attractions, and services available for people to explore and enjoy. We would like to take a moment today and share with you what our unit is currently doing in High Park to maintain and promote the natural areas, where there might be opportunities for improvement, and how we will be using the information gathered from the TRCA's Terrestrial Biological Inventory Report to guide our efforts.
There are many different city departments that work together in High Park. We'd like to start by outlining the Urban Forestry branch and its role in High Park. The Urban Forestry branch falls under the Parks Forestry and Recreation divisions, and there are 5 sections that make up Urban Forestry, as you can see on our slide. I'd like to highlight a few key sections and the roles they play in High Park. The Tree Protection and Plan Review section enforces the city's tree bylaws. High Park falls in a ravine protected area, so any projects taking place in the park are subject to review under the Ravine and Natural Feature Protection bylaw if it involves removal or injury of a tree, placing or dumping fill or refuse, or altering the existing grade of land. The Forest and Natural Area Management section works to manage and protect natural areas citywide. The Forest Healthcare Unit in this section focuses on tree pests and invasive insects. In High Park, they oversee the various tree health monitoring initiatives, including monitoring for oak decline and the gypsy moth treatment program. The Natural Resource Management Unit is the unit where Jacqueline and I both work. Our group works to manage the vegetative communities within the park using staff as well as some community engagement. Urban Forestry's Natural Resource Management Program works in natural areas found in ravines and parks citywide, as shown in green on this map. We also have a focus on environmentally significant areas, which are highlighted in orange. The main initiatives of our program include the management of invasive plant species and native species plantings that serve to improve biodiversity, support wildlife, and expand the urban canopy. The prescribed burn is a management tool that uses fire to preserve and enhance the black oak savanna habitats found in 3 city parks, High Park, Lambton Park, and South Humber Park. We carry out this work with support by natural resource worker field staff. Currently, we have 4 natural resource worker crews, and this map shows the distribution of these crews across the city. The crew based in High Park covers the 4 wards identified in orange. Our program also supports natural areas through a variety of other avenues, such as carrying out monitoring, playing an advisory role when projects are proposed in environmentally significant areas, undertaking site repair following projects in natural areas, as well as community engagements. Jacqueline, we can't hear you.
My apologies.
There we go.
Community engagement is an important aspect of natural area management, and the High Park community has a long-standing history of being actively engaged and involved in High Park. Urban Forestry has connected with the community through tours, presentations, stewardship field events, research, and virtual opportunities. All these community engagement events are centered on restoration and fostering understanding and respect of these important natural areas within High Park. One of my roles as Parks Program Officer involves community engagement. I am a recent addition to this role, and I am looking forward to continuing to grow the relationships that have been built and to building new relationships with this community and the different community groups engaged in High Park. I will be speaking more on engagement and in stewardship later on.
We have based the foundation of our vegetative management program in High Park off early studies that were carried out in High Park from 1976 and 1993. Gavin gave a really great timeline of a lot of those studies. These early studies identified the biological importance of the ecosystems within High Park and the need to protect and enhance them. In response, the creation of our 2002 vegetative management plan was developed. It provided a framework for restoring and enhancing the natural areas within High Park and offered tools that could be used to achieve this. And after almost 20 years of managing High Park's natural areas, the long-range goals and objectives of this plan are still very relevant and still what our core management program is geared to address. Urban Forestry has also produced and relied on a variety of supplemental documents that have supported the evolution of our management over time. One such document is the Restoring the Jewel of Toronto Park System. This is a publication that was used to share with the community the progress of natural area management happening in High Park, and it was last updated in 2008. Also in 2008, we hired a consultant to produce the Rare Plant Propagation Manual. This was a tool created to support our partners in the High Park Native Plant Nursery to use a targeted approach when collecting seed and propagating these rare significant species. In 2009, we also commissioned a report to map significant plant species in the park, and this is the Campster report that Gavin was referring to. Until now, this document was the most recent flora inventory that we had in the park. More recently, we have been working on a variety of new initiatives to update some of the baseline data to help us inform and review our practices. In 2018, we asked the TRCA to carry out some detailed trail mapping to update records of existing trails throughout the natural areas. As you can see in the map, there are quite a few trails running through the natural areas, but now we have these updated records that can be used to evaluate the impacts. In 2018, we also requested the TRCA carry out this updated biological inventory to give us some current flora and fauna records. In 2019, we also partnered with the University of Toronto on an ecological monitoring program for Toronto's ravines and natural areas. There are 300 of these plots scattered citywide, and 10 of them reside in High Park. This project is still ongoing, and we're hopeful the data gathered from these plots will help to track changes in progress in the vegetative communities in the park and help inform our protocols. We're also currently working on a review of our prescribed burn program, evaluating the conditions of our various burn units, and our intention from this is to generate an updated long-range burn plan for each individual burn unit within the park based on their unique requirements. As time progresses and as the city continues to grow, new challenges and pressures are emerging. So it is natural for us to try to assess the tools we've been using, the successes we have achieved, as well as recognizing the areas for improvement.
The focus for today is the recent TRCA Terrestrial Biological Inventory and how its findings will help to inform future management. Sue and Gavin have provided a great overview of the report methodology and findings and have presented some valuable observations about the natural areas in High Park. We wanted to briefly address some of the recommendations from the report and how this document will be used in our ongoing vegetative management in High Park. The TRCA recommendations are divided into 3 general headings: protecting and enhancing existing features, managing public use, and controlling invasive species. We will discuss our work based on these headings. The first group of recommendations focus on maintaining conditions in the park that allow plant communities or species of conservation concern to thrive. These recommendations all serve a larger objective of trying to prevent further loss of important species. On the slide, we've highlighted a few of the recommendations from the report, such as highlighting and communicating what we are working on, reviewing opportunities to expand the areas we currently manage, and focusing on the rare plant communities in the park that are sensitive to impacts.
The focus of Urban Forestry's vegetative management program in High Park has been on protecting and expanding the black oak savanna habitats, as well as the associated rare plant communities within those habitats. This concern was presented early on as being a priority to try to prevent loss of these rare plant populations within the region. So management efforts were therefore initially focused on the sections of park that had these habitats. As our program evolved and we've improved our approaches, we've expanded our management efforts now to cover approximately 80 hectares actively within the park. This means not every corner of the park is able to be managed actively, and we have seen some decline in some areas. So this presents us with some opportunities that we need to consider. 37 hectares of the park is being managed with fire through the prescribed burn program. Fire has long been used by Indigenous peoples to manage these types of fire-dependent ecosystems, and it was reintroduced as a management tool initially to address the lack of black oak regeneration observed in the park. It has been hugely successful in supporting the natural regeneration of the oaks and has also helped many of the fire-dependent species in the savanna ecosystem thrive. To supplement this natural regeneration, a targeted black oak planting program was also set up, which included growing seedlings from acorns collected in the park and then planting them out in areas where natural regeneration is still delayed, and as well trying to get these oaks planted in some of the manicured spaces to help increase the representation of black oaks across the park. An intensive native species planting program is also a big part of our vegetative management in High Park. The objective is to propagate and plant out High Park species into other areas of the park where these plants may not be successfully regenerating on their own, or they may have been lost. To date, approximately 68,700 plants have been planted by staff. A lot of thought goes into supporting this program, including careful consideration of seed material sourcing, which species to focus on growing, at what quantity, and which species groupings that we are planting out into the park. Reviewing the flora trends from this TRCA report will allow us to evaluate how the different species have fared and where more focus might be needed on supplementing some of the species in decline.
In relation to recommendations that serve to highlight and showcase the success of existing restoration work in the oak woodland and savanna habitats, we wanted to highlight our current approach. We currently actively engage with and support a variety of knowledge-sharing organizations where possible, such as leading in-field stewardship events with the High Park Stewards, contributing to the High Park Nature website, supporting restoration education at the High Park Nature Center, engaging the community by leading tours with the High Park Sunday Walking Tour Group, and providing educational restoration tours to universities. Urban Forestry has also begun highlighting activities, information, and successes through social media. We are exploring additional avenues to broaden our sharing about restoration work. One of our goals is to include more communication in a variety of formats, as we recognize that education and information are key tools in protecting natural areas.
The second group of recommendations from the report address managing public use. These help serve to highlight the various challenges that a busy urban park experiences and are concerns that we are hearing a lot coming through the community outreach. Things like trail creation, multiple user groups resulting in heavy usage, trampling impacts, and just overall negative impacts to natural areas. So many of these issues are quite complex and require combined efforts from a variety of city divisions and partners to problem solve. Our unit has been working to focus on the impact to public uses that we can achieve through community engagement and stewardship.
One of the community groups with whom we have had a long-standing relationship is the High Park Stewards. Urban Forestry has been leading stewardship events with the High Park Stewards for almost 2 decades. The map here shows the natural areas in High Park in which High Park Stewards have helped with invasive species removal and native species plantings in the last 5 years alone. During those 5 years, over 1,300 individuals participated in 70 events, and invasive species were managed in approximately 9.6 hectares. And over the last 12 years, over 27,800 native plants were planted with stewards. They have made a significant contribution toward the ongoing management of High Park's natural areas. Another organization with whom we've had a long-standing relationship and for whom we provide direct support is the High Park Nature Center. We provide plant material and guidance in support of the Nature Center's ongoing educational nature programming for kids, families, and the community. The High Park community is expanding and growing, and we are excited at the prospect of helping to develop and support further stewardship opportunities, as well as to expand and engage with other user groups. This directly supports the TRCA's recommendation to continue to include the community in restoration efforts, which will increase awareness, enhance the natural areas, and may help to reduce impacts. The final group of recommendations in the report recognize the impact that invasive species can have on the landscape and the importance of appropriate management. Since 2000, High Park has had a dedicated restoration crew whose role includes invasive species management, and as part of the vegetative management program, they have tested numerous approaches to help establish best management practices in High Park that are effective on a landscape scale.
The invasive species management program is one of our most intensive programs, and our last 2 slides, we're going to address it. I mean, this could be a presentation all in itself, so I will I'll quickly give a bit of a rundown about how we approach this. When we began the vegetative management program in 2000, we initially thought we'd be able to eradicate the invasive species within High Park and then be able to focus on other initiatives. However, within the first few years, we realized this was not a realistic goal. Many of the invasive species that are present in High Park have been well established for a long time, so they're not new populations, and as such, they are widespread across the park, have heavy seed banks within the soil, and in some of the more disturbed areas, they've already begun outcompeting native species. So our focus had to shift from hopes of eradication towards a goal of establishing a balance. One where invasive species populations are kept at low levels, so native species are able to persist in the landscape and not be outcompeted. We've had some small gains where locally we have been able to reduce populations of the most aggressive species, but the seed sources are still prevalent, and with the amount of foot traffic in the park, seeds are constantly being spread. Our primary goal is to focus efforts in areas where we can see the most beneficial impact on the native plant communities. So our program approach can be summarized as follows. We manage about 14 invasive species in High Park. The plants themselves can vary from annual to perennial. Some are only present in heavily disturbed areas, while some are very prolific, that they are able to enter healthy, intact ecosystems and take over. Manual control is always our first method of control, and in some cases, like garlic mustard, it can be very effective, but it requires significant time investment. In our experience, it takes about 3 to 5 years to see reduction. Chemical control is another tool that can be effective on species that are not able to be managed on a landscape scale with manual efforts. We use chemicals in a spot treatment approach and target just the specific plant that we are managing, and only after we've tried other approaches without success. In most cases, we employ a combination of manual control, prescribed fire, and chemical control to optimize the impact that we're having with as little product as possible. Our invasive species management program is continually updating and adapting based on the best management practices used in the industry. We participate on the board of the Ontario Invasive Plant Council so that we are in touch with current research trends on management of invasive species, and we have constant communication with our practitioners in other regions, districts, conservation authorities who are managing similar species. We are doing all of this because we see the impacts that invasive species can have on the native plant communities, and we're hopeful that these efforts will preserve the important plants that are present in the park and in turn end up providing beneficial habitat to the fauna and insects that rely on them.
We know High Park has a special place in so many people's hearts, and we hope we've been able to give you a glimpse of what we've been doing to try and work to protect these important natural areas. We also recognize there are lots of opportunities for all of us to do more. We want to thank Sue and Gavin for sharing their report with all of us, and to thank Daniel and Pablo for facilitating and running this event. Most of all, thank you all so much for joining us today for this presentation of TRCA's High Park Terrestrial Biological Inventory.
Thank you, Jennifer and Jacqueline. There are a few additional questions, and I think I'm going to ask Sue. Is it Sue that I'm asking to speak? Yeah, to the issue of insect populations.
So the question was speaking specifically, I think, about bird and insect declines, and then possibly a link with glyphosate, I think was the question. So I can speak generally about just declines in biodiversity to begin with. I'm not going to make any links with glyphosate because that is not my area of expertise, but I can say, to speak to more regionally, the declines in bird species are, it's not obviously an issue just in Toronto or High Park. It is a global issue with declines in our biodiversity. Bird species in particular, and in urban environments, they're under a lot of stress. For some of those species that are more sensitive, we have a lot of pressures. There are a lot of, and I'm going to, free roaming cats are a huge problem in cities. There's a lot of predators. So we're missing out on a lot of those ground nesting species that I spoke about. They're just too sensitive in an urban environment. So as we continue to develop and fragment the landscape, more and more habitat becomes unsuitable. I spoke a little bit about the aerial insectivores and the connections with insects. Certainly that seems to be what the leading cause is for those species declines, and they're listed as species at risk. And it's and I'm speaking just about the breeding grounds, but obviously, you know, a lot of these bird species are migratory, and so they travel thousands of kilometers down south. They have overwintering habitats and territories that they set up, and so there's pressures on them all across their life cycle. So I'll say that it's not a single issue. The connection with glyphosate, I have not had any I don't have any research that suggests that there is a connection. Certainly with some of the pesticides, this is a herbicide. Some pesticides certainly have an impact, and we're starting to see that with bird species, with the neonicotinoids. I'm not going to say that correctly, but certainly there's starting to be a connection with that particular pesticide. We're speaking about a herbicide, but so I'm going to stay within my knowledge of what I know here to speak to that question.
Thanks, Sue. Are you or someone else also able to speak to the issue? There's a question here about soil surveying and mapping and whether that would be worthwhile as a protection tool, for example, this just changed on me, for ericoid mycorrhizal fungi, or does the ELC already cover this?
Okay, I will address that question. I think soil survey would be an excellent idea. It's in terms of the level of soil surveying that we have the resources to do, we basically just do a subset of polygons and examine the soil textures and moisture regime. But what's actually living in the soil, Bill Montague, you're right. It's a huge thing. Like earthworms, for example, are non-native, and they're having a huge impact on vegetation communities and regeneration, particularly more on finer textured soils like clays and silts, and particularly in forests. But the mycorrhizae, you really need to have like a real kind of academic research team to check that out, and I really do think there's a lot going on there. Obviously, there's been some work done on dog spinning vine and how it alters it basically takes over the soil and actually actively changes the mycorrhizal community to suit itself and kick out, the ericoid mycorrhizal fungi that things like blueberries and the blueberries and huckleberry would rely on. So there's definitely changes in the soil biota, but we could barely scratch the surface of that at this point. And yes, I do think it would be an excellent idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I have one last question. We only have time for one more because we're over time now. So there is a question about poison ivy, whether or not it's an invasive species. Paul says he's seeing no efforts to control the spread of this plant. The northeast meadow has large areas, including the main path, where poison ivy is growing over the path. Jennifer, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can address poison ivy. It is a native species, and there are wildlife that rely on it. So really, I think poison ivy is more of a nuisance to people. And it really does like High Park and the sandy soils. It also really likes being burned. So that is sort of a side effect of some of the prescribed burn programs. We have seen in areas where we are burning, the poison ivy is spreading. We don't manage it as an invasive species, and the only management that I think is currently taking place is from park staff. So if it's a health and safety concern, park staff will manage it along the edges of trails, along major access points, but we aren't managing it in the natural areas because it is considered a native species. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, everyone, thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. We will make a record of all the questions and answers that we received during this event, and if we missed any, we will send out an email with like a Q&A sheet with all those questions and answers recorded in case we missed anything. So thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming out and staying for this presentation. We know it was a lot of information to digest, but thank you for sticking around. And in case unless anyone else has anything to say, I think that's it. We'll wrap up. Thanks very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.